Okay, nerds, geeks, assorted and/or confederated dorkwads, we need to talk. Geek culture, here a term describing the increasingly amorphous mix of fandoms, subcultures, hobbies, etc., has always been known for strong opinions and very specific lines of demarcation. But there was always one thing that united all of it, a shared sense of overriding persecution by, or at least callous dismissal from, the so-called mainstream popular culture. In other words, for the bulk of the period wherein various nerd subcultures had a sense of themselves as a subculture, they tended to define themselves not just as what they were, but what they weren't. To be geek was also to be an iconoclast, willingly separate from and even rebellious against a larger, more powerful, and infrequently threatening mainstream culture. We were outsiders, outcasts, and self-styled rebels. Keyword in that sentence, though, were, because however marginalized and maligned we thought we were for a long run of this whole thing, we sure as hell aren't anymore. Oh, individually we may still be, to be sure, and not every aspect of any culture is going to be widely accepted, but in the big grand scheme of things right now, geek culture and the vast spectrum of nerd ephemera has largely come to dominate what we used to call the mainstream culture. Hollywood used to scramble to get their biggest movies into international festivals like Cannes for maximum exposure. Now they want to go to the San Diego Comic-Con. HBO's current answer to The Sopranos is Game of Thrones. Gadget fetishism is now hip. The functional space between the culture of computer nerds and the digitally unified mainstream world can be measured in microns. Pacific Rim is one of the most advertised movies on ESPN. Speaking of ESPN, have you seen what sports culture has morphed into over the last decade? Looks kinda familiar to me. Video games are both cutting-edge trendy to the point of obnoxiousness, and also so ubiquitous that they're kind of square. Top man cave accessories went from antlers and taps to arcade stand-ups, pinball, and more high-end video tech than the Starship Enterprise. Speaking of the Enterprise, one of the biggest mass-audience blockbuster movies this year was about Star Trek, while other contenders are built around Superman, Iron Man, and Wolverine. The Target Zero movie that every studio now wants to do their equivalent to is The Avengers. The original, not based on anything previous big movies this summer, include mech pilots fighting monsters and guys in powered armor invading a space station. My mother binge-watches Once Upon a Time with the kind of attention I used to put toward Babylon 5. Doctor Who is a popular TV show in the United States. Hell, that should be enough to end the point right there. Doctor Who is a popular TV show in the United States. Yeah, sure, some of this stuff will always be considered niche, but that hardly precludes cultural influence or power. NASCAR is still considered a niche sport because it's only really popular in certain parts of the United States, but niche in that case is worth billions of dollars, and as such, the sport's corporate masters have a lot of weight to throw around. My point is, for all intents and purpose, we won. The popular culture, chiefly of North America, but thanks to globalism of increasingly the world, has been remade in the image of, well, my bedroom, circa 1993 or so. This, more or less, is ours now. We, as a collective entity, are no longer some unusual growth on the side of the popular culture. We are, by and large, its driving force. The will that huge swaths of the media and markets bends to is our will, and the trend does not look to be reversing anytime soon. We have the power. But, like the man said,
with great power comes great responsibility.
Geek culture may have started out as a sanctuary and gradually transformed into an insurgency, but whatever it is now is something else entirely. And while the iconography of the bullied nerd will always be a key part of geek culture's internal mythology, I propose that it's time for us to accept and indeed embrace that the defensive stance of a persecuted people no longer suits us, and that if we are to be the new mainstream, it is indeed incumbent upon us to take up the responsibility of that power to be a better mainstream than what came before. Because make no mistake, geek culture was never exactly perfect, and its flaws have unfortunately been magnified along with its cultural ubiquity. It was always an open secret, you see, that for all the pretense toward refuge for those who are different, geek culture was always chiefly thought of and built around really only one classical nerd archetype. White, male, heterosexual, cisgendered, first world with enough disposable income to afford their hobbies. And while it was common for idealized depictions of the culture to imagine that welcoming and understanding communities were the rule, after all, persecution must empathize with other persecution, yes, in reality, sexism, racism, and other forms of cliquish and exclusionary behavior were often the ugly underbelly of the whole scene. Now, that never should have been the case, period, but it's especially out of place now that so-called geek culture is such a dominant force in popular culture. A culture that built so much of its sense of self around resistance to persecution and oppression has no moral or logical rationale to become an oppressor itself when it attains a seat of power, and yet too often that's exactly what we've done. Online gaming and internet forum culture is an ocean of racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and downright hateful rhetoric. like the convention circuit act like enduring sexual harassment is some kind of acceptable entry fee for women. When someone even hints at talking about gender roles in video games, we act like it's Wounded Knee and We're the Lakota. That nonsense needs to stop, now more than ever. If the self-described geek community now holds power in the mainstream, then it has a responsibility to wield that power for good. Geek culture always presumed itself to be somehow ahead of the curve intellectually, philosophically, etc. Well, I propose that it's high time we started acting like it. We who are unwelcome ought to be the most welcoming. We who claim to know persecution should now be champions for the persecuted. To simply cut down on or even purge bigotry and intolerance from our ranks is not enough. We should be using the power of those ranks to take the fight to hatred and backward thinking. I don't know exactly what form Geek Culture 3.0 will ultimately take, but I do know that it has the opportunity to be a progressive force, a force for good, a force for change. We always said we could do better, that we were better. It's time we proved that. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.